Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I am Brandon Vaught, the content director at Word on Fire and the host of the show, and joining me, fresh off of his retreat with all the other American bishops at his old stomping grounds, Mundelein Seminary, is the great Bishop Barron. Bishop Barron, good to talk with you.
Brandon, always a joy to be with you.
Hey, catch us up a little bit. So we haven't talked really since Christmas, so maybe tell us a little bit about, you went home to Chicago for Christmas?
I did. Yeah, I saw my family because my mom is back there, my brother and sister, and a lot of family and friends and people I've not seen for a long time. So I spent pretty much that week, right after Christmas. My car, I keep a car that I had when I was in Chicago. My sister now, uses it. So when I'm home, she lets me use it again. And using that, I just went around and visited lots of different people, mostly my family, my mom, who's in assisted living right now. So I spend, good family time with them.
And then it also just happened to work out that Pope Francis requested all the American bishops have this retreat, and they planned it in Chicago right after Christmas. So you were already there. You got to go on this retreat. It was at Mundelein, where you have spent many, many years of your life.
Yeah.
Give us a little taste of what the retreat was like.
It was good. A lot of people came. I was about 250 bishops, which is a pretty good compliment. That's probably what we usually get at the November meeting every year. Very good mood, I'd say, at the retreat. People enjoyed the camaraderie. We don't get together in that prayerful way all that often. Usually when we get together, it's for a business meeting. So to be in that environment was really good. The talks were by Father Cantalamessa, who is the official preacher to the papal household. Has had that job for 40 years. He told us it was in 1980 he started with John Paul II. And it continued all during John Paul's time and then through Benedict's time, now into Pope Francis' time. And he was good. He's 84 years old, but pretty spry, smart, very patristic. The talks were not like just frothy experientialism. There was a lot of substance to them. He's deeply Augustinian. He quoted Augustine like every other line. So I appreciated the intelligence and substance of his talks. He's got kind of a wry sense of humor. A little playful smile is usually not far from his lips, So I think we all enjoyed his presentations, and we enjoyed the general feel of it. And another interesting thing is, I say this as a native Chicagoan, there was almost a miracle with the weather, because early January typically is like the worst weather of the whole year. It's usually 10 degrees and snow, and precisely for the period of the retreat. It was miserable before. It resumed being miserable today in Chicago. But for that little period, it was in the upper 40s or low 50s, plenty of sunshine. And so that was a real grace. We were able to get out and walk and, see the beautiful campus and all that. One of the highlights for me, actually, a group of about 20 bishops asked me to give a tour of the John Paul II chapel. So, the house chapel that I kind of supervised a major renovation of when I was rector, and we dedicated it to John Paul II. We put in 19 beautiful stained glass windows of saints that he had beatified and so on. So it was a joy for me to see it again, because I hadn't seen the chapel in over a year. And then to give a tour of it to these bishops was a great joy for me.
Well, today we're going to be talking about a sort of viral New York Times op-ed piece that is making its way around the internet. It's written by Ross Douthat, who's a Catholic journalist, columnist for the New York Times. We've worked with Ross before. He was featured in our documentary series on Catholicism, The New Evangelization. He's also the author of a best-selling book called Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics. That was a few years back. But this article is titled The Return of Paganism, and it offers some really provocative thoughts and trends on American spirituality. I thought we'd kick it around a little bit. Okay, so he begins this article with an interesting observation. I wanted to get your take on this. He says, even with America's churches in decline, and you and I have talked about all of these statistics, the religion impulse has hardly disappeared. He says that in the early 2000s, over 40% of Americans answered with an emphatic yes when Gallup, the researching group, asked them if, quote, a profound religious experience or awakening, end quote, had redirected their lives. 40% said, yes, that's happened to me. But Douthat observes that that number is double what it was in the 1960s when institutional religion was more vigorous. So as institutional religion declined, the number of people who have profound religious experiences or awakenings has doubled. He also notes that a recent Pew survey on secularization found increases in the share of Americans who have regular feelings of spiritual peace and well-being. What do you make of that? What's your first intuition?
Well, my first intuition is to agree that the religious impulse never goes away. It's so deep in us. We're wired for God, as Augustine taught us, and everyone knows that deep down. And so try as you might, and secularists and skeptics have been trying for centuries to knock religion out of us. Or think of someone like Marx, who felt, the way a snake just sheds its skin, that modern people will just kind of shed this old religious hang up. Freud saying much the same thing in the early 20th century, Sartre echoing that. I mean, those who predicted the demise of religion are numerous. And the one thing they all have in common is they're wrong. It's so deep in us that it doesn't really go away. It is re-expressed. It finds a new direction. The negative side of it is our friend Chesterton's famous line about when you stop believing in God, you don't believe in nothing, you believe in anything. That's the negative side of it. The impulse is kind of hooks on to whatever. Douthat's pointing to something that's more positive, that there it is, and it seeks legitimate outlets. Now, we would say relatively adequate or relatively inadequate, but it's there stubbornly. And I find that appealing and encouraging in the work that I do, that you're trying to reach out to something, and you can kind of trust that you're going to find traction with almost everybody in appealing to religion. So that side of it, I think, is right.
So then Douthat continues. He notes that, several years back, he said, Douthat, wrote this book called Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics. And that book argues that it's not that American culture is becoming more secular, they're throwing off religion altogether. It's that they're becoming quasi-Christian, quasi-religious. They're a nation of heretics. They believe some good things, some bad things. But in this new article, just a few weeks ago, he says, I've come to wonder if my earlier book was incomplete, if not wrong. There's come a point at which a heresy becomes simply post-Christian, a moment when you should just believe people who claim they've left the biblical world picture behind, a context where the new spiritualities add up to a new religion. So he doesn't think we're becoming more secular. He doesn't necessarily think we're becoming more heretical or quasi-Christian. He thinks there's actually a new religion arising, and he later describes it as, quote, NeoPaganism. I want to dig into this NeoPaganism and what he means and what other sociologists mean. Douthat spends the rest of the article referencing a new book called Pagans and Christians in the City. And it's written by Stephen Smith, a law professor at University of San Diego. And here's what he says, this new paganism that's arising. He says what's happening behind the scenes in modern culture is the return of a pagan religious conception, which was half buried by the rise of Christianity, although never fully so. He says this paganism is not materialist or atheistic. It allows for belief in spiritual and supernatural realities, maybe even the afterlife, but it's deliberately agnostic about final things, what awaits beyond the shores of this world. It's skeptical of the idea there exists some ascetic, world-denying moral standard to which we should aspire. And then this one I think is most interesting. It sees the purpose of religion and spirituality as more therapeutic, a means of seeking harmony with nature and happiness in the everyday. Does that sound like the sort of vague spirituality you encounter among a lot of people?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I go back many years ago, my great intellectual hero, Monsignor Robert Sokolowski, when he was introducing us to the great Catholic intellectual tradition, I remember it very clearly. He said, guys, if you stop being Christian, I'd recommend you become pagan. And his point was that there is something very deep and true and noble in paganism. Now, what he meant by it, this goes back many years, what he meant was paganism is the great religion of the natural necessities. So he saw the pagan gods and goddesses as symbolic evocations of these fundamental structures, these necessary principles that undergird our ordinary experience. So think of, the sea. So that you have the god of the sea, of Poseidon. You have various gods of nature that represent the different aspects of nature in its beauty, in its threat, in its unpredictability. So think now of the stories of the gods and goddesses who are often like, oh, capricious, and boy, she changed her mind quickly. Well, that's the weather. You know what I mean? That's nature. Let's say you're bringing a group of kids out for a nature hike, and you're up in the mountains, and man, it's just beautiful, and it's wonderful, and it's rich, and what an experience. But then you lose your way, and the weather changes, and now night falls, and you've lost your path. That mountain that was just intriguing and beautiful and now becomes very dangerous indeed. As I record these words, Brandon, this is the first anniversary of the terrible mudslide in Montecito that killed about 20 some people a year ago, 10 minutes from where I'm sitting. The mountains here in Santa Barbara, gosh, they're gorgeous, beautiful, wonderful. And 99 times out of 100, when you're going by, you say, wow, what a privilege, to live in such a place. A year ago today, that mountain turned deadly, This sort of thing is reflected in the great stories of the gods and goddesses who are capricious, it seems, and they change their mind, and they're wonderful and they're frightening. Take Sokolowski's point now through something like the Star Wars spirituality, the Force that has both a light side and a dark side. Well, that's true. That's simply the case. When you're within the natural realm, there's this quality of reality that's both beautiful and deeply frightening. So good. There's something kind of noble and true and right in acknowledging these natural necessities, if you want, paying tribute to them, honoring them as far more powerful and ancient and enduring than you are. That song was Kansas, right? All we are is dust in the wind. That song always struck me as expressing what Sokolowski meant by classical paganism. So, I mean, we're dust in the wind. All that lasts forever is the earth and sky, right? They say that's a very ancient perspective. So honoring these gods and goddesses of the natural necessities, yeah, that's a fundamental and basically healthy form of religiosity, And some of the greatest spirits in the ancient world were pagan in that sense. That was their approach to the world. So I get it. Now, what's really interesting, and I think we'll get to this, what does the Bible add to? How does the Bible question and caution and not utterly repudiate, How does it take in paganism but transform it? Those are interesting questions. And I think what Dalth is getting at is as the biblical view fades for a lot of people, what is going to reassert itself is this classical religious form, paganism. So I get that. I mean, New Age spirituality in a way is a kind of neo-paganism. So sure, I get it. And it's not altogether bad. It's something you can perhaps work with when you're trying to propagate the biblical view.
I know something you've harped on many times before is that materialistic reductionism, or materialism, to use another phrase, won't satisfy the desires of the human heart. That when people try to live that way, they realize there's just something more. There's a transcendent realm beyond just the mere material world. And I think a lot of people are drawn to paganism because of that. It may reject, the rigid, objective moral system of Christianity. It might reject all the biblical additions to that view. But at least, even the pagans recognize there's more to reality than just this world. And that's part of its attraction.
Well, you see here, I don't know. I go back to Sokolowski, and if that's the framework, that paganism is a celebration of the natural necessities. See, one of the differences is that, say what you want about the pagan gods and goddesses, they were realities within the framework of the world. So now think of it more in sort of mythological terms of the gods on Mount Olympus. They are superhuman figures. They're like us, and they're operating within the world of ordinary experience. Now, at a higher pitch. Now, translate that into our terms, you get not so much Batman, but you get Superman and the superheroes, right? Are a bit like the ancient gods and goddesses, but they're still operating within the basic context of nature. The fundamental biblical difference is when you talk about the God who created the heavens and the earth, which is shorthand for the whole realm of finitude, right? God is not in the world as an object, as I've often said, following Thomas Aquinas and everybody else. God is not the supreme instance of a natural being. God is not, the most fundamental of all the natural necessities. No, the creator God is totaliter aliter, as they used to say, right? He's totally other. That's a difference, I think, between classical paganism and biblical religion. That sense of the distinction between God and the world that has reached a new level of intensity in the biblical revelation.
All right, let's hop back to Douthit's article here. So he's making the case that this neo-paganism is rising once more, but he says in order for it to fully revive, it needs to unite two different streams of ancient paganism. He said ancient paganism had two streams. Modern paganism needs both of them too if it's going to be successful. The first one, he says, is the tradition of intellectual and aesthetic pantheism that includes figures like Spinoza, Nietzsche, Emerson, and Whitman, and that's manifest in certain highbrow spiritual but not religious writers today. What's he describing here? What's this tradition?
Well, no, I think that's another way of saying the natural necessities, but call it now at the sublimest level. So a Spinoza or Emerson or Whitman, fundamentally pantheistic. Think of Emerson's oversoul, or think of the way Whitman sort of celebrates, the beauty of nature. Or Spinoza, who's imitated very closely by Schleiermacher, the founder of modern liberal Protestantism, that identifies basically God and nature writ large, right? So think of it this way. If the gods and goddesses are relatively minor natural necessities, think of the overarching great necessity, which is nature itself. That's God in the full sense within a pagan framework. Or if you want to use the Spinoza, Schleiermacher, Emerson, Whitman thing within a pantheistic framework, the Bible, will take all of that and shake it. You know what I'm saying? They're all attempts to stay within the world of our experience. Even, Schleiermacher, who says, look, I'm beginning with experience, the experience of the infinite. That's the mark of liberalism, by the way, in theology, is that you start with human experience. The Bible is something else. It's the creator God who brings into being in its totality what we mean by nature or the whole or whatever. That God has now spoken. See, and once you make that move, you're in a different spiritual space, period. You're in a much more dangerous spiritual space, if I can put it that way. See, there's something, for all of its honesty, and I'm with Sokolowski, there's something beautiful, honest, noble about paganism. But for all of that, there's something relatively tame about it because you're still within the natural space, right? Then there's the Bible, which is this, breakthrough, this word of God that comes from outside of that natural totality, turning it upside down in a way. That makes all the difference.
So Douthit says the revival of this neo-paganism depends first on this sort of intellectual aesthetic pantheism. But then second, this one's interesting, in ancient paganism, there was always a civic religion that makes religious and political duties identical. He says it treats the city of man as the city of God or the city of gods, the place where we make heaven ourselves instead of waiting for the next life or the apocalypse, this imminent civic religion is gradually replacing the more biblical form of civil religion. Two examples he gives are the social justice theology of contemporary progressive politics on the one hand, or this is what especially struck me, the transhumanist projects of Silicon Valley. And one could think of, figures like Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg and the quasi-religious fervor around their projects. What do you think about this second element of paganism, that it's like a civic paganism that makes religious and political duties?
Yeah, there's a lot to that, I think. The title that the Pope now has, Pontifex Maximus, right? The great bridge builder. Julius Caesar had that title in the ancient world. He was the Pontifex Maximus. It was a religious role, but it was exercised by what we would call today political figures. But for the ancient Romans, that distinction was not nearly as clear. They would have seen that, sure, that's a public role to be this priestly figure, a certain identification of the government and the societal structure with the will of the gods or the goddesses. We pay homage to you. You'll support the political system. Yeah, in a way, it's the political arrangement reflecting and giving expression to these more fundamental natural necessities. And so I think they are woven together in classical paganism in a way that the Bible, think now of the prophets who speak not from within the natural framework, but they channel the word of God, the creator. And what's their usual approach? Not, hey, you're all doing great to the kings of Israel, but usually it's a word of sharp criticism. And even think of God vis-a-vis the sacrifices of Israel. Do you think I need your sacrifices? I mean, do you think I'm drinking the blood of goats? Do you think I'm consuming the smoke of your sacrifices? God, as it were, undermining or questioning the civic religion of ancient Israel. See, that's a different perspective. That's not the somewhat cozy, tidy pagan weaving together of the natural necessities and the political order. It's God who's outside of the totality of finitude, who, if you want, questions both the natural necessities and the political order, see, from a higher perspective. Now, that's not to say that God is at odds necessarily with these things. No, there's plenty of room for that. The heavens proclaim the glory of God, and the king of Israel, if he's morally upright, can reflect the moral seriousness of God. So that's true. Nevertheless, there's never a simple identification or weaving together of nature and God or politics and God. The true God transcends and questions both of them. So that's a very interesting, it's a subtle point, but an important one. Biblical people are always uneasy with civic religion. There's a role for the civis, for the city, right? And Augustine acknowledges that there's a role for the political, but the city of God and the city of man are two very different things. And woe to you if you try to think them together too readily. And so I think that's a very valid point he's making there.
I can't help but think, when talking about paganism and the revival of NeoPaganism, of some of our favorite English writers like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and Chesterton, all of whom deeply reverence the ancient pagan traditions because they saw it as a foreshadowing of Christ, the myth made real, as Lewis and Tolkien said. Do you think we can still find sort of seeds of the word in these ancient pagan traditions?
Which is exactly what the church fathers did, right? And that phrase you just used there, which I love, the semina verbi, the church fathers, that was their strategy. Now, were they critical of ancient paganism? Pick up the City of God sometime. If you want 2,500 pages of criticism of what's really off kilter in it. But at the same time, were they willing and able to take in the best of the pagan spirituality, if you want? Sure. And that's the church embracing much of what we call today pagan philosophy. Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, etc. I mean, these are, if you want, pagan figures. They were operating religiously within that framework I was describing. Okay, the church took in much of their reflection. Is there a reflection even of elements of pagan religiosity? Sure, church took in, baptized, elevated, etc. So I think the same move can be made today. Is we look for semina verbi. There are semina verbi in even these forms of pantheism. Our friend Chesterton, who was one of his very early influences when he was still largely agnostic, Walt Whitman. So the young Chesterton reads Walt Whitman, and it has a huge impact on him. Now, he leaves Walt Whitman behind in many ways, but yet Whitman opened a lot of doors. I think, Brandon, in our time, someone like Joseph Campbell, I've referred to a few times, he's before your generation, but like 25 years ago, those famous interviews with Bill Moyers. And in some ways, Campbell is like a neo-pagan, where he was calling on these great ancient, now he did it in a Jungian way, these kind of archetypal forms of religiosity. Good. I know for a lot of people, Campbell opened doors to faith. And may I say, in a way similar to Jordan Peterson today, who is another Jungian looking at the archetypal dimension of the biblical stories and is calling upon, if you want, certain pagan forms of religiosity. Okay, that can be a door, that can be a way in. Use them, don't succumb to them, don't simply buy the whole pagan project, but find and use elements of it. I think that's good.
Douthit wraps up his article here in the New York Times by saying it seems like we're some distance away from that happening, that being a revival of paganism, from the intellectuals as pagans donning actual druidic robes, or from Jeff Bezos playing Pontifex Maximus, the phrase you used, for a post-Christian civic cult. Now, he says, occasional experiments in woke witchcraft and astrology notwithstanding, there's a more elite embarrassment about the popular side of post-Christian spirituality. So he's a little skeptical that this neo-paganism is fully going to take off. But I guess I'd close with this question to you. Suppose you were sitting in front of someone who feels drawn to this neo-paganism, either this intellectual pantheism or this civic religion. What do you say to them as a Catholic bishop?
Well, I probably want to get some traction and say, what are you finding most compelling in this form of religiosity? And they probably speak of, whether it's a nature mysticism, or they'd speak of maybe a sense of connection with the world, with nature, with people through nature, et cetera. Good. We can work with that. I can build on that. I'd probably press in that Augustinian direction. Again, Augustine, who knew and reverenced so much of the pagan world. He was trained in it. It was his milieu, But then he also, from a higher perspective, turned on it in great criticism. So I might venture that sort of critique. If you're the least bit tempted to think that our political order, whether it's like your social justice warrior stuff, boy, oh boy, we're going to build the perfect world. Well, good luck with that project, To point out the demonic elements, I'll use that strong word, but I think accurate word, the demonic elements within a pagan viewpoint. Remember that, Brandon, several years ago I did a video on it, the Hollywood stars all kind of extolling nature and kind of addressing nature as this great mother. And what they were all saying was, she's wonderful and she is really a tough mama. I mean, nature is not someone you want to mess with. And I said, yeah, right. That's right. You start treating nature as God. Well, you're in relation to a very ambiguous reality. I mean, that's a very dangerous conversation partner. The true God, who is the creator of the heavens and the earth, now we're in a different spiritual space. And I would suggest a much healthier spiritual space. So I try to find some traction, and then I would point out the limitations of this pagan approach.
That sound means it is time for our regular question. If you have a question, send it in to us. We'd love to hear it. Just visit askbishopbarron.com and record your question on any device. Today we hear from David in Raleigh, North Carolina. He's got a really interesting question here about Jesus and the second coming. So here's David's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is David, and I'm calling from Raleigh, North Carolina. My question is about the second coming of Christ. Why would God have wanted two comings? In other words, why not just accomplish at his first coming what we expect him to do in the second? Why give us this in-between time? God bless.
That's good. Here's my basic answer. I don't know. I say that because you're dealing with a person. You're dealing with God, whose intentions we can't finally fathom. So the answer to a lot of questions about the particularities of how and why God acts is appropriately, I don't know. I let God do what God wants on his own terms. Now, having said that, that remains in place. Can we gesture toward answers? And perhaps this way. It seems to be, just looking at nature, history as well, but it seems to be a preference of God that things happen gradually. The law of gradual process seems to hold, doesn't it, across the board, the way things gradually come to be. The child in the womb, all of us moving our way through life, plants and animals that grow and develop and unfold. It seems to be part of God's plan. And so the history of salvation, too, unfolds and evolves in different stages. Now, next step. Why would that be to our advantage? Well, think if everything is just said and done at one time, boom, over, done. Well, then what role is there for us with our own minds and wills and energies and passions and projects to participate in what God is doing? See, Aquinas says that God delights in using secondary causes and in giving those causes what he calls the dignitas causalitatis, the dignity of causality, that we can participate in a very real way in the work of God. So between the first and second comings, what do we find? But the church, the era of the church. And the church is the growth of God's kingdom under the guidance of the Holy Spirit on earth. And think now of all the priests, prophets, and kings, all the baptized over these now 20 centuries who've been able to participate in this great providential work of God. That wouldn't have happened if it was all done in the first coming. But this, if you want, lovely space that opens up between the first and second coming is the space of the church where, hey, now I can get into this game. I can play, If it's all done for me once and for all, it seems to obviate the law of process, and it also obviates my own participation, in that dignitas causalitatis. So that's at least a gesture toward the answer, which is finally, I don't know. It's in God's providence.
Well, I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode. If you want to read the full article that we've been discussing by Ross Douthat, we've linked to it here in the show notes. Also, I want to encourage you, if you haven't already, pick up Bishop Barron's latest book. It's called Arguing Religion, A Bishop Speaks at Facebook and Google. It is now the #1 new release on Amazon in both the Catholicism and the atheism categories, which is kind of exciting. So go to wordonfireshow.com/religion to pick it up. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week on the Word on Fire Show.